Between 1982 and 1984, the Midwest's third most prolific serial killer was actively running around, murdering boys and young men. Police knew who he was. They knew how many young men he'd killed, yet they let him go 3 times. How did William Eyler escape justice so many times, and how could authorities possibly allow this madman to go out and kill 25 children and young men? Well, let's find out, shall we? Here's the story of the Interstate Killer. Let's get into it. Little Larry didn't exactly have the best upbringing. His father was a raging alcoholic that beat and shouted at his wife and 4 children day in and day out. When that marriage crapped out, his mother went through 3 more marriages, all the same. Lots of drinking, shouting, beatings, and every new man had a few more creative punishments for Larry in store. Despite all of the men in her life, not one of them was any good at putting food on the table. If the kids were lucky, they saw their mother maybe twice a week during her incessant rotation between the many jobs she held down to keep them fed and clothed. And at school, well, Larry didn't have a much better time there either. He went to school in Lebanon, Indiana. Quiet, tall, gangly, and well, an overall odd boy. Larry was picked on constantly. His sister, Teresa, was known to stand up for her brother on more than one occasion, and she wasn't afraid to punch a kid twice her size if she had to. They were tight, the Eyler kids, because that's all that Larry and his siblings had, each other. When their mother couldn't make rent, they were often placed in foster care or, if they were lucky, with relatives. So it shouldn't be surprising that Larry started becoming hot-tempered in his preteen years. With all that violence, instability, and no constants in his life, Larry began to lash out at the world. His mother placed him in a home for unruly boys. There, he developed a rather religious streak. Not that that helped his anger issues much. He was back home in a few weeks, but moved to another facility just a few months after that. During these hoppings around, Larry was questioned by a few doctors that noted that his severe insecurities stemmed from his extreme fear of abandonment and separation. To make matters worse, Larry soon realized that he was gay. If his current stepfather had nearly drowned him for slamming a door too hard, what on earth would the next one do to him if he found out that Larry was gay too? The 1960s weren't exactly tolerant of guys like Larry. Funny thing, his siblings and mother accepted him, despite the conservative times. But he still wrestled with his sexuality thanks to a combination of his deep-seated insecurities, his religious convictions, and the general attitude towards the gay community during those times. He drifted through high school and then from job to job, eventually finding himself in the underground gay scene of Indianapolis. Larry created a shell for himself. On the outside, he was a charming, easygoing guy who spoke softly and got along with everyone. But in truth, all of his relationships were superficial, and he'd long since learned that if he didn't hide the true rage inside, he'd be sent away again. But he couldn't quite hide his propensity for deviancy and violence. Many of his flings reported that Larry couldn't look at their faces while they were intimate. Instead, he'd close his eyes, pretend they were women, and shout derogatory terms into the air targeted towards females, refusing to come to terms with his sexuality even in the middle of intimacy. That was just the start. Things were about to get a lot darker. Larry became downright sadistic with his partners. He beat them, cut them with knives, and generally scared the living daylights out of all of his one-night stands. That's probably why none of them stuck around for a long-term relationship. All except for 2 men. He had this weird 3-way relationship with a married guy, John Dobrovolsky's. John's wife was fully aware of her husband's sexual orientation, but she was fine with it as long as their occasional housemate paid half the rent. Oh, it gets weirder. They had 5 children in the home, and the kids were completely aware of their father's boyfriend. Eyler was extremely possessive and needed constant reassurances that John was not seeing other men. He shouted derogatory insults at him and tied him up before lashing him with whips. In other words, Eyler had a living practice dummy for what he'd do to his future victims. The other on-again boyfriend was a college professor named Robert Little. Little was as sadistic as Eyler and thrived on violence and blood. We'll get back to Little in just a sec, so keep him in mind for now. In August of 1978, just 2 months before his 23rd birthday, was when Eyler finally tried to take that final step toward murder. Not that he succeeded, but he could have been caught then and there. But like so many of the serial killers we've covered before, Eyler slipped through the cracks. He picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker, Craig Long. Eyler tied him up, and while he was busy unbuttoning his pants, Craig tried to run, resulting in Eyler stabbing him in the chest. Craig played dead, so Eyler left him there, fully convinced that he'd killed him. When police found the wounded young man, Eyler drove right up to them and told them that it was an accident. They searched Eyler's car and found the most hair-raising items imaginable: a hunting knife, a butcher's knife, handcuffs, tear gas, and most concerningly of all, a steel-tipped whip and a freaking sword. To make matters worse, Craig dropped the charges of aggravated assault. Eyler's lawyers offered him $2,500, and he decided that he'd rather not have his terrible ordeal become common knowledge. Eyler got off with only a $48 court charge and the determination not to let his next victim live. It's here that the highway killer truly came into existence. Well, sort of. He definitely tried very hard to kill Craig Townsend in October of 1982. Craig was beaten so badly that Eyler left him, believing that he was dead just like his previous victim. Craig escaped from the hospital before police could question him because he didn't want the public to know about his assault either. If he had, then maybe the slew of murders that followed could have been prevented. Stephen Crockett and Edgar Underkoffler were killed in 1982 as well. They were beaten, bound, stabbed, strangled, and whipped, but none of the victims were physically assaulted sexually. The killer got off on the torture, not the physical act of penetration. A true sadist in every sense of the word.
News Center 10 has learned those murders are Steve Agan of Terre Haute, whose body was found in Vermilion County last December, John Roach, whose body was found in Putnam County, and Daniel McNevey, who was found in Hendricks County in May of 1982.
Searching his truck and this house on Keene Lane in Terre Haute where he'd stayed, all without cause.
The sheer amount of overkill, the fact that all of the victims were in their teens and 20s, and the small radius of where the victims were found, well, it didn't take police and the papers long to recognize a pattern. The highway killer, or sometimes known as the Interstate Killer, was utterly vicious, and he moved at a frightening pace. John Johnson, William Lewis, John Roach, and Stephen Agan came next. Stephen was suspended from the rafters of an abandoned barn and tortured so viciously that they found bits of flesh on the walls and roof. Police thought for a while that there must be more than one killer. No way could one man subject this level of hideous torture alone. The multitude of weapons added to that theory. I mean, they were stabbed, strangled, beaten with fists and whips. The level of rage was just too much for one person to possibly contain within themselves.
Body was found in a wooded area near Highway 63, not far from Newport, Indiana, in Vermilion County.
He just wasn't sure who they were. They were nameless people to him.
In '83, the body of Irvin Gibson was found laid over the corpse of a dead dog. Both had been stabbed to death. Daniel Scott McNeve was discovered stabbed so many times that his internal organs were outside his body. Just 9 days later, Richard Bruce was killed, followed quickly by Jay Reynolds and Jimmy Roberts. The gay community were the ones who really steamrolled this investigation into overdrive. Not only did they make a great deal of noise about it, the only gay-centered magazine, The Works, printed articles and collected money to offer a $1,500 reward for any information. The state police were complete buffoons trying to solve this. Their plan of action was to raid gay bars looking for the killer, like they expected to find him standing in the middle of a dance floor with a knife or something. the FBI took over and put a stop to the incessant harassment of the gay community. It didn't take long for them to find that first assault on Craig Long. It was one of the articles published by the works that led to the tip. An ex-boyfriend of Eyler called in telling them about the arrest and Eyler's frightening personality in the bedroom and his obsession with inflicting pain on his lovers. They put out a team to surveil Eyler, now a gas station employee, as well as a few other possible suspects. But they still managed to let him slip out of sight for long enough to kill Ralph Calise, an unidentified Hispanic man, and Gustavo Herrera. He was now up to 17 victims, the youngest of which was 14-year-old Delvoyd Baker. 18-year-old Eric Hansen was discovered in October, dismembered with a hacksaw. Apparently, Eyler wanted even more gore to satisfy those demons inside of him. 4 more victims were found buried under an oak tree close to an abandoned farmhouse in Lake Village, Indiana. And to end off the year, Richard Wayne was found just feet away from an unidentified African-American victim. In September of '83, Eyler was arrested for a traffic violation with a hitchhiker in the car who was probably going to be his next victim. In the car, they found knives with blood on it, nylon rope, handcuffs, a hammer, 2 baseball bats, a mallet, and surgical tape. His shoes matched imprints at one of the crime scenes, and his car's tires matched the tracks at several others. Inconceivably, Eyler was let go. I know, it sounds insane, but the hitchhiker in the truck was unharmed, and all those deadly items found in the truck were going to take months to analyze. This was 80s technology they were working with, after all. So technically, they couldn't legally hold him in jail. Something odd came up during questioning, though. Even though he hung out at gay bars, his family and friends knew that he was gay and he had a boyfriend. Eyler refused to admit that he was gay or to speak of his sexuality at all. His mother and sisters rallied around him, unable to believe that their brother, whom they'd seen through the worst of times, could possibly be a murderer. But his ex-boyfriends totally could. Police got an earful of Eyler's strange and frightening sexual deviances when they interviewed them. It wasn't until they located Craig Townsend that the investigation took a turn for the better. He was the first victim that managed to run away. Now, with a credible witness, they had enough legal pull to devote all of their time to a proper surveillance of Eyler. The constant presence of police drove Eyler insane. He filed a lawsuit for psychological warfare, demanding $500,000 in damages. The nerve of this guy. They tried to arrest him for the murder of Ralph Calise, but there still wasn't enough evidence to take it to trial. Then the body of David Block turned up. Eyler had somehow managed to slip by his surveillance detail to kill another innocent victim. Even with half the Midwest police on his trail, Eyler couldn't help himself. He had to kill again. A few days later, on August 21, 1984, the janitor in Eyler's apartment building found the dismembered body of Daniel Bridges, just 16 years old. One of 13 children, Danny had been a sex worker since the age of just 12. Danny was found cut into 8 separate pieces, each one of them drained completely of blood. Without enough time to clean up his bathroom, Eyler had no circumstantial evidence to hide behind anymore. He was found guilty of murdering Danny Bridges and waited on death row for a few years. So technically, he was only ever charged for 1 murder and the assault of Townsend. Not exactly what police wanted, but it was better than nothing. They didn't have to wait long for more concrete evidence of how many Eyler truly killed. By 1990, Eyler had gone from HIV positive to full-blown AIDS. He was going to die from the disease eventually anyway, but death row would come quicker if he had the right medication. So he opted to try to get the death penalty thrown out to buy himself more time. So Eyler made a deal to get out of the death penalty. He wrote a 17-page confession for the murder of Danny Bridges, Stephen Agar, Ralph Calise, and 22 others. But with the added bombshell admittance that the college professor and ex-boyfriend Robert Little was a willing participant in some of the murders. Police had long since suspected that Little was an accomplice, since he was the only lover of Eyler's that had refused to speak to police. Little was found not guilty, though most agree that he probably had some hand in Eyler's crimes, especially given the fact that Eyler had given so many details about locations, names, and injuries that it was highly unlikely that he was lying. Before authorities could decide whether or not to take the death penalty off the table for Eyler, he died of AIDS-related complications in prison on March 6, 1994. It's safe to say that we know of 25 victims because Eyler admitted to them all, but 3 of them have not yet been identified because he couldn't remember their names. Unfortunately, even if he did confess to them all, the case will not be closed until those last 3 victims have been identified and reunited with their families. And that's why we cover these cases on Evidence Obscured. Even an unusual killer like Eyler, who actually confessed to all of his killings, there are still victims out there whose families deserve answers. The more we talk, ask questions, and scratch at old wounds, the more likely it is that something will shake loose and those families will get answers someday. So keep talking, keep asking, and never stop the pursuit of finding the missing and the unnamed victims. And, leave a like, a comment, and don't subscribe while you're at it. Our team is always down in the comments. We take receipts, we add your suggestions to our docket, and we sincerely appreciate your engagement. See you in the next one, people.